What Dr. Saholt says, Dr. Saholt describes 8 pillars of health, drawing from frameworks like New Start, that go beyond just eat well plus exercise. His list includes nutrition, exercise, sunlight, water, air temperance, i.e., avoidance of excess harm, rest trust, in a community, faith or larger purpose. Podcast notes +1. In his interview, he emphasizes that many of us neglect the light pillar and that sunlight, red, and infrared light may be underappreciated for things like mitochondrial function, immune resilience, circadian rhythm, chronic disease risk. Podcast notes +2. The Singju Post +2. Specifically, he states things like, I've been a real proponent of getting people outside into the sun. Podcast notes. He highlights infrared light, longer wavelengths from the sun and outdoors, as beneficial for mitochondrial function, lowering inflammation, perhaps better insulin sensitivity. Podcast notes +1. He also states that even in cloudy or indoor settings, there are ways to replicate some of the benefits, e.g., artificial light, red infrared therapy, when exposure is low. Podcast notes. So, yes, he does recommend paying attention to your light exposure, sunlight plus good quality light, as part of overall health. What the science shows and what we should interpret cautiously. Here are key findings and caveats. Evidence in favor, sunlight and mortality, chronic disease. Studies have shown that greater sun exposure is associated with lower all-cause mortality, lower cardiovascular disease, and lower cancer mortality. For example, a Swedish cohort of 30,000 women over 20 years found higher sun exposure correlates with lower mortality. Podcast notes +1. There is evidence that being outdoors, in nature, among trees, green spaces, which increases infrared, red light, and fresh air, is linked to lower inflammation. Podcast notes hospitals and older institutions used large windows, sunlight exposure for patients. Modern indoor environments may reduce that exposure and possibly slow recovery. Podcast notes +1. Mechanistic plausibility. Sunlight includes UV, visible, and infrared wavelengths. Infrared light penetrates deeper into tissue and may stimulate mitochondrial function, energy production, reduce oxidative stress, free radicals, and support cellular health. Podcast notes. Light exposure also influences circadian rhythms, sleep-wake cycle, melatonin production, hormone regulation, mood, e.g., seasonal affective disorder, and immune function. Wikipedia +1 practical minimums. Some suggest target exposure like 15 to 20 minutes of sunlight per day on face arms is a good baseline. Podcast notes. Even on cloudy days, some infrared and visible light penetrates. Thus, outside time still counts. Podcast notes +1 what we should interpret with caution, causality versus correlation. Many studies showing sun exposure and health outcomes are observational. People who get more sun may also have other healthy behaviors. Risk of sun, UV exposure. Sunlight also carries risks. Skin aging, skin cancers, sunburn, etc., especially excessive UV. So the benefit-risk balance depends on amount of exposure, skin type, geography, time of day. Saholt does address that the risk of melanoma may be overemphasized in some contexts, but UV still requires caution. Podcast notes +1. Infrared red light therapies. While promising, many devices are not yet large-scale proven for everyday health and are sometimes marketed with overpromising claims. Individual variation, skin type, geographic location, latitude, season, time spent indoors, outdoors, windows that filter certain light, etc., all change how much beneficial light one receives and how it impacts health. Complex disease dynamics. If someone is critically ill, for example, as you described a serious infection plus lung involvement, getting sunlight might help for mood, circadian, immune, but it's not a substitute for medical intervention. The story you shared, 15-year-old boy with blood cancer plus lung flesh-eating infection, is powerful. Whether sunlight alone caused improvement is hard to isolate. but sunlight may have been a useful adjunct to medical care. Supporting recovery. Practical takeaways. What you can do, especially in a cloudy, less sunny country, here are actionable ideas. Adapted to your context, Hanoi, Vietnam, Asia, Bangkok time zone, but you're in Hanoi, and also for cloudy or indoor settings. Get outside regularly. Aim for at least 15-20 minutes of outdoor sunlight exposure each day, if possible. Ideally, when the sun is up and there is visible and infrared light, not direct midday harsh UV if you're sensitive. If you're bedridden, ill, or indoors, try to position the bed chair near a window where you can get natural light and view the outdoors. Some studies show that hospital patients with windows get discharged faster or have better outcomes. Whenever possible, spend time in a green space, park, trees, exposure to sunlight, plus. Tree-reflected infrared, plus fresh air seems beneficial. Use lighting smartly when direct sun is limited, on cloudy days or in places with limited sun exposure. Winter, indoor work, high latitudes. You can use bright light lamps, red, near-infrared light devices, though pick a clinically validated one, to imitate some of the benefits. Dr. Sahult mentions artificial 10,000 lux light plus red infrared therapy as alternatives. Podcast Notes Policy 1. Ensure the indoor environment has good daylight exposure, i.e. windows, natural light rather than sitting entirely in artificial dim lighting. Adapt exposure to your skin, health status. If you have fair skin, are prone to sunburn or skin cancer, then balance sun exposure. Avoid overexposure. Use protective clothing, shock hats. Avoid peak UV times. If you're very ill, immunocompromised, or in hospital, ask your medical team about whether it's safe, how to get light exposure safely, especially if outdoors is difficult. Use window exposure as a fallback. Even being near a window where sun, or bright sky, hits your skin can help circadian rhythm and mood, even if less UV, though for vitamin D production, you may need direct skin exposure. Support circadian rhythm, sleep and quality of light. Get morning light within 30-60 minutes of waking. This helps reset your circadian rhythm and improve alertness, mood, sleep later. In the evening, night, minimize bright blue-white light, screens, artificial bright bulbs, because they reduce melatonin, disrupt sleep, impair recovery. Ensure your sleeping environment is suitably dark to allow melatonin release and well ventilated, good air quality. If indoor lighting is dull during day, get brighter ambient light during the day. This helps the contrast between day and night. Integration with other pillars. Light exposure is not the only factor. It complements other pillars: exercise, good nutrition, hydration, water, clean air, rest, avoidance of harmful exposures, and having meaningful trust community. For example, being outdoors gives you both light and fresh air and possibly physical movement, walking, and connection to nature, social interaction. So it's synergistic. A caveat: the story you shared, you. Described a story. A 15-year-old diagnosed with blood cancer develops a flesh-eating lung infection. Is terminal, but upon going outside, the infection improves dramatically. While that is powerful, from a scientific standpoint, we must be cautious about attributing cause and effect. It's possible that the sunlight outside exposure did play a meaningful role. Improving mood, circadian rhythm, immune response may be aiding recovery. But many other factors, medical treatment, antibiotics, antifungals, immune status, underlying cancer therapy, removal of source of infection, overall care will also have large effect. We cannot guarantee that sunlight alone is responsible, but it may have been a helpful adjunct. The anecdote is consistent with the idea that light exposure can help in severe illness, especially through nonspecific mechanisms like strengthening immunity, improving recovery environment, reducing stress. But it doesn't prove sunlight cures flesh-eating infection. My summary. Recommendation: yes. I. do think it's very reasonable and wise to recommend regular sunlight, good light exposure as part of a holistic health approach. In fact, given the low cost and relatively low risk, when done sensibly, it is a good low-hanging fruit intervention. But it is not a panacea, and one must balance with other health behaviors and individual risk factors. In your case, and generally in a hospital or serious illness scenario, you could suggest, if medically feasible, encourage the patient to be taken outside or at least to a window with natural light and fresh air for some minutes each day. Keep it safe. Avoid extreme sun, heat, stress. Ensure hydration. Coordinate with medical team. Use the window or indoor bright light, red, infrared modality as backup if outdoor exposure is not possible. Combine with good sleep, hydration, nutrition, air quality, and trust community support, since stress and sleep and immune function all tie together. The story of Henry, a 15-year-old boy, and the power of sunlight. In my daily work in the intensive care unit, I regularly see life and death situations. One of them changed my perspective on sunlight and the natural power of the human body. It's the story of Henry, a 15-year-old boy diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, a form of blood cancer. Henry began chemotherapy, which is standard treatment but has severe side effects. It suppresses the immune system, leaving the body vulnerable to serious infections. Not long after, Henry contracted a rare flesh-eating fungus in his lungs. His condition rapidly worsened, forcing doctors to remove his entire left lung to save his life. However, even with only his right lung remaining, the infection spread to the remaining lung. The family and medical team were devastated. They held a patient conference. The boy was fully awake, fully aware, and on a BiPAP ventilator. At this point, Henry had only one small request. "I just want to go outside for a little while. I want to feel the sunshine." The doctors and nurses agreed. They moved Henry's bed out into the hospital courtyard so he could get some fresh air and sunlight. And what happened next surprised everyone. After 2 days, a CT scan showed that the infection in Henry's lungs had reduced by 60 to 70%. No one can fully explain it, but one thing is becoming clear. Sunlight has more benefits than we once thought. Lessons from the story. Many people mistakenly believe that sunlight is the only source of vitamin D and that supplements can replace it. But that's not the case. Sunlight, especially infrared light, can penetrate as deep as 8 mm below the skin, stimulating mitochondria, increasing intracellular melatonin production, and reducing inflammation, protecting neurons, the heart, and blood sugar metabolism. Light not only nourishes the body, but also regulates the body clock, improves sleep, mood, and the immune system. In fact, research shows that patients who lie near hospital windows recover faster and are discharged earlier than others. Larger lessons from critical care medicine. In modern medicine, when a stroke patient is admitted to the hospital, we can inject TPA or TNK, drugs that help break up blood clots in the brain's vessels and restore blood flow, sometimes reversing symptoms almost completely. But these drugs also carry the risk of bleeding elsewhere. That shows, sometimes to save a weak link in the body, we are forced to accept the trade-off of other links. However, after saving the patient, if I do not help them understand why the stroke occurred and how to prevent it in the future, then I have not completed my mission. 8 pillars of health. So, instead of just treating the problem when it happens, we need to strengthen all the links in our health chain through the 8 basic pillars that I often share. Nutrition. Food is medicine. Eating right helps prevent and reverse disease. Exercise. Natural medicine has positive side effects, reducing strokes, depression, and increasing longevity. Water, not just for drinking, but also for external therapy, saunas, cold baths, hot baths, to help boost immunity. Sunlight supports immunity, sleep, mood, and many other cellular functions in addition to vitamin D. Air, fresh air, and exposure to nature help reduce stress and boost immunity. Moderation. Avoid overdoing it. Not intubation, but it's on his mouth. And the doctors, have done everything they possibly can, and they say, "Look, he's getting worse. Obviously, we can't take the right lung out. We can't put him on a heart-lung machine because there's no sort of destination to where he's going. We recommend not intubating him and making him what they call DNR. Do not resuscitate. So they're like, wow, they were not expecting this coming. So they have a big conference, somebody they call and help to, like, how do you explain to a 15-year-old boy that you're dying, and how is that going to feel? So they ask the doctors how much time does he have? They say 2 days. So in this situation, they ask this boy, okay, you're going tootie. What do you want to do with your life in the next 2 days? What do you want to do? And surprisingly, he says, I want to go outside. I just want to go outside. This guy grew up probably on a farm or something, and he spent his time outside. So he wants to go outside. So, you know how I mean? I don't know if you know this, but like if you're a nurse or you're a doctor and you've done everything you can in this and you're just completely horrified at the fact that this 15-year-old is going to die and he has one request. You're going to move heaven and earth to fulfill that one request. And that's exactly what they do. They get this boy the hospital bed outside. He's on a BPA machine the respiratory therapists have put together. So this guy is outside, and they're not putting him outside to get better. This is his dying wish. They also use this thing called a firefly. It's like a light device that they were using. I'll be honest, I don't know which did it. The firefly. What's that? It's a light device that gives off light at different wavelengths, and they would use that for about 3 times a day for 5 minutes. This guy does not die. After the first day, his white count starts to come down. That's like a measure of the infection that's going on in the lung. And by the way, they do a CT scan of his lung before this all starts. And it's just the remaining lung on the right is just filled with infection. It's horrible. By the second day, the white count comes down even more. And there, by the way, they haven't changed any of the other treatment. By this point, he's been in for 6 weeks. He's not seen the light of day, and he's still getting the powerful antifungal medication amphotericin B and posanazole. All of these things are really high-powered drugs that just completely fight fungus, but it's not working. He's getting worse. But now he's out for the second day. The white count's coming down, which is good. It's a good sign. His oxygen requirement is coming down. That's a good sign. He's requiring less and less oxygen. By the time he gets to day 5, okay, we're already past 2 days. He's off the BiPAP. He's on regular just nasal cannula oxygen that you see people wearing on their nose. The doctors are scratching their head. They're like, we should get a CT scan to see what's going on. So Amy tells me that they get a CT scan of this guy, and they're in the room, and some even like swear under their breath like they're completely amazed because on the CT scan, obviously, the left lung is still gone, but the right lung, the disease is probably 60–70% gone, and he's still alive. He goes home. There's no sign of the disease after treatment. And she just communicated with me to tell me that he just got his Make-A-Wish thing for his cancer. He's continuing treatment. And she just can't believe that he was literally 2 days away from dying. They changed nothing. They changed none of his treatments. The only thing that they did was they took him outside, and they were using this firefly before inside, but they were using it more consistently when he got outside. Maybe hospitals should be outside. This is exactly what. Okay, so if you wanted to know what my drive was, what it is my purpose that I'm doing right now, I'm working at 3 different hospitals, and I'm trying to work in each of those 3 different hospitals to try to get patients outside. The biggest barrier that we have is staff taking those patients outside. That's the thing that's the hardest. But this is what we used to do, Stephen. This is what we used when we built hospitals at the turn of the century. We had hospital rooms where beds could be taken out onto the veranda and people could get sunlight. I would love to see a time where we could go back to that type of effect. There's studies that have been done. People in a 2-bedroom, if you're the bed closer to the window, you get discharged from the hospital faster on average. Really? Yes. I need to swap sides of the bed with my girlfriend. She's on the sunny side. There's so much evidence for this. People who are in hospitals that have bigger windows, they give better surveys. And hospitals, reimbursement is tied to the surveys that they get from patients. So it's literally a win-win-win. If hospitals started to, I believe, get patients outside, and they're already doing this there, I don't want to say that this isn't. Some hospitals have now started programs to get patients outside to get some natural light, and I think this should be done more. Next is temperance, a rather old-fashioned word meaning moderation, TTR. As a pulmonologist, I see the consequences of intemperance all the time: lung cancer from smoking, liver failure from alcohol abuse, and meth addiction in Southern California, where I live and work. If you want to live a long and healthy life, the first thing you need to do is stay away from those toxins. When you do this, you will significantly improve your health in every way. Air may seem obvious, but it is important to understand it correctly. I used to think that good air was pure air containing only nitrogen and oxygen. Now we know that is not true. Just as our gut has a microflora, microphy, healthy air needs natural microorganisms. And the best air you can breathe is K. Rest is also an essential pillar. Some people wonder, why are exercise and rest both pillars of health? Aren't they opposites? Actually, it's about knowing when to move and when to rest. Getting enough and quality sleep is a weekly rest, a real day off. Ask yourself, how many of us actually put down our phones? Stop reading emails. Stop working. Finally, there is trust, and science. People with strong religious or spiritual beliefs often cope better with stress, depression, and anxiety. Whether you believe in God or some other spiritual force, faith gives strength to the mind and body. If you notice, the 8 principles I just mentioned are arranged in a special order: nutrition, exercise, water, sunlight, 2A, rest, and trust. When abbreviated, they form the letter NU-S. This concept was developed by Weimar University in Northern California, where they have built an international healthcare program called based on these 8 principles. When asked which pillar he wanted to start with, Dr. Schwelt said that sunlight was something he was particularly interested in because it was the lowest hanging fruit. He explained that his journey to realizing the importance of sunlight began with the COVID-19 pandemic. As an intensive care physician, he noticed that patients who died were not just those with respiratory illnesses, but also those who were obese, had heart disease, kidney disease, or dementia, all of which are linked to mitochondrial dysfunction. From there, he delved into the research on the connection between sunlight, cellular energy, and aging, how natural light helps restore health and prolong life. 70%. Can you imagine running your house on 70% less energy? How fundamentally that would change what happens in your house. Like, you could not run the laundry the same way. You could not run the microwave and the laundry at the same time. And what does that look like in terms of symptoms? Excellent question. Because what it looks like is, depending on the cell type that we're talking about, that's going to have the issue. So, if we're talking about the liver is going to get more fatty. If we're talking about the heart's going to become more congested. If we're talking about the brain, it's going to have more dementia. And so what's happening here is that as we get older, the batteries in our cells are not working the same way as they used to. Metabolism is slowing down. And so these are huge issues. And all of these diseases that I just talked about, all the ones that we saw in COVID, if you look in a lot of these diseases, they are rooted in mitochondrial dysfunction. So the question is why is that the case, and what can we do about it? So there was a paper that came out in 2019 that fundamentally changed the way I saw this. It was written by Russell Reiter, who is the executive editor of Melatonin Research. He's out of University of Texas, and Scott Zimmerman, who's a light engineer. And what they set forth was to show that basically sunlight is made up of so many different types of wavelengths. You've got ultraviolet on one end, which of course makes vitamin D, and it's very beneficial. It's the type of light from the sun that is very short wave but cannot penetrate very deeply. Let me back up a little bit and explain. You pull up to a stop sign and somebody pulls up next to you and they're playing the latest hip-hop music. How does that sound to you in your car? It's very boom, right? Yeah, and muffled. It muffled. And the reason why is because low-wave frequency has the ability to travel very far. Go to the Grand Canyon and there's a thunderstorm at the other end of it. What do you hear? It's like a rumbling. And then as it gets closer, you hear the higher pitch sounds. This is a fundamental physics principle. And so when the sun is shining, There's very short wavelengths, ultraviolet B involved in vitamin D. But at the other end, there's this infrared light, which we'll talk about, or red light. It's very long wavelength and it can penetrate very, very deeply. That's very important because what we're talking about is the human body. And if the sun is going to have an effect on the human body, it's got to be more than just the skin. So that's exactly what this paper showed, is that basically infrared light from the sun is able to penetrate probably up to about 8 centimeters, according to Scott Zimmerman in this article. And it fundamentally interacts with specifically the mitochondria. And what does it do to the mitochondria? So let's back up and talk about the mitochondria because this is central. The mitochondria to the cell is like the engine in your car. The engine produces locomotion that causes the wheels to spin. But in the process of doing it, it causes heat to surround the engine. And if you don't deal with that heat, it will shut down the engine. It will make it more inefficient, and eventually it will shut it down. So what do all internal combustion engines have? They have a cooling system. They have a radiator. They have an oil pan. They have a water pump, and that's exactly what the cell has to have for the mitochondria. It's not heat in the mitochondria. It's called oxidative stress, and it's specifically oxidative stress that causes destruction destruction of the mitochondria and leads to these types of diseases. So oxidative stress causes the mitochondria not to work well. This leads to diabetes. Oxidative stress makes the mitochondria not work so well. This leads to dementia. So this has already been laid out. This is not that controversial. The controversial part is what do we do about it? So what these guys in this paper showed was that, and not just them, but look, reviewing the literature, is that the mitochondria makes its own cooling system, and that cooling system is melatonin. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, melatonin isn't that the stuff that we take that our brain makes right before we go to sleep? Yeah, it's absolutely correct. That's what happens. The problem is that this is not melatonin that's made in the brain. This is not melatonin that goes through the blood supply and goes through our blood and tells us it's time to go to sleep. This is melatonin that's made in the cell in the mitochondria, and it's a powerful antioxidant that basically prevents the oxidative stress from occurring. What Scott Zimmerman and Russell Reiter proposed in this was that basically the infrared radiation that's coming into the body is able to stimulate and upregulate melatonin and a number of other factors that keep the mitochondria cool and can actually improve the energy output of the mitochondria. So this was actually mind-blowing to me, and I'll tell you why I resonated with this as a critical care physician, because there was 2 sunlight and viruses impact on COVID-19 things that bothered me the most. Number 1, SARS-CoV-2 virus, when it comes into the body, it interacts with something called the A2 receptor. You may have heard about the A2 receptor. Okay. This is where the virus actually latches onto the cell and gets internalized. So what is this A2 receptor? Is this there for all of humanity just to be a receptor, or does it actually have a role? It turns out it actually has a role, and mind-blowingly, the A2 receptor is involved in mitigating oxidative stress. So in other words, it's another part of the cell's cooling system for the mitochondria. What's happening is that the virus, when it attaches to the cell, is basically eliminating that action. And so imagine you have a bunch of people with various different engines running at different temperatures. In other words, you've got some people with chronic disease and we know their engines are running hot. We have other people who are completely healthy and they're doing quite well. Their engines are nice and cool. They have no problems at all. Now imagine COVID comes and SARS-CoV-2 is infecting everybody. What that tendency is to do is because it's knocking out everybody's A2 receptor, which has the ability to cool down the engine. In other words, it's causing everybody's engine to run hot, right? So in other words, picture this way, you're driving along in your car and your thermometer is there, and all of a sudden there's this big hill that you have to climb called COVID-19. Who's going to make it over that hill, and who's not going to make it over that hill? The people that make it over the hill are those with great cooling engines whose temperatures are running great. The ones that don't make it over that hill are the ones that have the thermometer on their engine running hot. Those are the ones that poop out at the top and can't make it. And they're the ones pulled over to the side of the road with the hood up and the steam coming out of the engine. Do you understand what I'm saying? Of course. So this makes perfect sense to me why I wasn't seeing what they were predicting, which is these respiratory patients coming into the ICU. Who was I seeing in the ICU? I was seeing people with dementia, as we talked about, diabetes, kidney disease. These are the ones that were sick. Vitamin D, and this was not even controversial. We knew early on in the pandemic that people who came into the hospital and had higher levels of vitamin D did really well. They didn't die. They didn't have the same chances of dying. People who had low vitamin D levels, they had much higher chances of dying. So we would check these vitamin D levels. And so, think about this. You're there at ground zero and you're taking care of these patients, and you see this data over and over and over again that vitamin D is very predictive of who's going to die. Obviously, what are you going to do? Even though this is an associative study and that association doesn't mean causation, you're going to be giving people vitamin D and try to get those levels up. The problem is that we gave vitamin D and it really didn't have much of an effect. So you gave it in supplement type? Yeah. When people would come into the hospital like this? Exactly, just like that. I already took my vitamin D tablet this morning. That's very hard to overdose, but it's possible. So you notice that it was hard to treat people with vitamin D, but giving them a tablet didn't really do much. That's correct. Why? Well, this is what I believe is the fact. We saw that people with high levels of vitamin D or normal levels of vitamin D did better than those that had low levels. I believe that that was a marker of something else. In other words, people who had higher levels of vitamin D meant that they were out in the sun more. They were outside more than those people that had very low vitamin D levels. The people with low vitamin D levels were telling me, these are people that were not getting outside into the sun, and so what's the real factor here? What's doing the heavy lifting? And I would propose, and Scott Zimmerman, and Russell Ryder would propose, and I can tell you a number of other scientists that would agree with me on this, is that infrared radiation from the sun is causing an effect at the mitochondrial level in terms of oxidative stress, and that vitamin D was just the marker of who was getting the infrared light and who was not, who was going outside and who was not going outside. So when the sun is shining, for the most part, you're getting infrared light. You're getting the entire biological spectrum from the sun. We can go to the longest wavelength, which is far infrared, all the way to the shortest wavelength, which is ultraviolet B, okay? Which makes vitamin D. So in other words, when you are outside in a natural environment, you're getting a very broad spectrum of light. And so because of that, if you're getting infrared light, you're also going to be making vitamin D. And now that can change, because in the wintertime, when the sun is lower in the sky, especially, in England, this is a special issue at that latitude. When the sun is low in the sky, it's got the light that has to penetrate obliquely through the atmosphere. And because of that, shortwave radiation from the sun, like ultraviolet B, does not make it very well. So there's times of the year where you're not getting enough ultraviolet B, or maybe even no ultraviolet B from the sun, which makes the vitamin D, and that you're going to be deficient. You need to supplement. However, during that same period of time when you're not getting enough vitamin D because there's no ultraviolet B radiation, that sun is low, but it's still enough to allow that long wavelength penetrating infrared light to still come through. So, is the long-wave infrared light the benefits of using infrared light devices type of thing that we see these gadgets doing? Absolutely. And I would say, just to be specific, because you can see that as red light there, that's not infrared light because you can see it. So infrared light technically is completely invisible. But these do give out infrared light, you just can't see it. Exactly. So it's toward that red end of the spectrum. And people like Glenn Jeffrey out of UCL are actually doing research at 670 nanometers of red light and have shown in randomized control trials that that type of light, right there at 670, the type that you can even see, actually does improve mitochondrial efficiency. He's shown this in a number of randomized control trials. It improves eyesight. And you have to realize that the retina at the back of your eye is very rich in mitochondria. He's shown this in terms of managing glucose and output from mitochondria. And the reason why these things work so well is because what's going on here is as you get older, Your skin starts to become more saggy because the fibroblasts, or the cells in your skin, they're designed to make collagen. And collagen is the skeleton that makes your skin soft and supple. Yeah, don't mind me, please. No. So this is exactly it. My wife uses the same thing. This is a fun charged one. So what's going on right now is that red light, which can penetrate very deeply down, is going into the skin, and it is activating the mitochondria in your fibroblasts to produce more energy, which those cells need to deposit collagen. And so when you deposit collagen, that's going to give the skin a more tight feel, because as you get older, that collagen deposition is going to get less and less and less. So, this is going to help keep me looking young. That's the whole point of it. And you're saying that the light in these penetrates, what, 6 or 7 centimeters? Or is it infrared, does about 8 centimeters? This red light would be a little bit less, because this light, obviously, you can see it. So it is a little bit shorter wavelength. But yes, this red light can penetrate deeper than, for instance, yellow light or blue light. And it's this light particularly that interacts with the mitochondria to increase that. So, should we be putting this all over our body? Because, okay, it's good for my skin, but if it's penetrating deeper, presumably there are other parts of my body that would benefit from that. Other mitochondria. It's interesting you say that. The study that I'm referring to with Glenn Jeffrey out of University College London, he took young people in this study, he gave them a bunch of glucose, and everybody who gets a bunch of glucose should have a spike in their blood sugar. And he randomized them on their backs to see what would happen when he shined red lights on their backs. And the people that got the red light had lower spikes. In other words, it seemed as though the mitochondria were metabolizing faster, which caused less of a spike of the glucose in their blood. The way he confirmed that is looking for the byproducts of the mitochondrial metabolism, which is carbon dioxide. So, when we breathe, when we metabolize, we're breathing out carbon dioxide, which is the result of mitochondrial metabolism. And in fact, in those people that had the light on, it showed a higher level of carbon dioxide in the exhaled breath. The whole point of that is to get back to your question, whether we should be putting this all over your body. He was able to get that effect system. That was a systemic ability. But we don't understand everything about the mitochondria. But what we do seem to understand is that they can communicate with each other, and that you don't need to have this all over the body to have systemic effects. In this particular case, though, if you want to have the skin here to be more, younger looking, then it makes sense that this is where you need to have it. If you want to have a particular other part of your body to look younger, then perhaps that's where the light needs to go. So interesting. That's a very good question. If you talk to Glenn Jeffrey, which I have, he noticed an improvement in 15 minutes. What did he notice in 15 minutes? He said he has studied the mitochondria in fruit flies, in mosquitoes and bees, and in human beings, and it's the same every time. He says after about 15 to 20 minutes of this type of light in that type of setting, there is a switch that turns on, and you don't need further stimulation. Further stimulation doesn't do anything more. It's a very bizarre thing. You would think that the more light that you gave, the more the effect would be. It's not. After about 15 minutes, there's something that changes in the mitochondria. There are certain theories about where this might be. This might be in the electron transport chain complex, EV. These are very technical things. There's a lot of studies. There are actually a number of groups that are looking at this. There's a whole area of science called photobiomodulation but 15 minutes is really what it takes. So we're not talking about a long period of time. This is really, really interesting. Getting back to my experience in the intensive care unit, the vitamin D wasn't working. These patients were dying, and it became clear to me that COVID was a metabolic issue for these patients. By the time I had realized this, the pandemic arguably is still going on because people are still becoming infected. But the rush to come into the hospital and the number of bodies that we were seeing circulating through the intensive care unit had dropped dramatically. And at that point, I was able to see that potentially infrared light may be very, very beneficial in these patients with COVID-19. Now, there was a study in Brazil. They took COVID patients that were sick enough to be admitted to the hospital, but not too sick to be intubated in an intensive care unit. And they did something tremendous. They actually manufactured a jacket that they could put on patients. And on the inside of this jacket were these that gave off infrared radiation at exactly 940 nanometers. They put the jackets on and they randomized, assigned which jacket was turned on and which jacket was turned off. It was blinded because the light coming from this jacket could not be seen by the human eye. It wasn't even enough to produce noticeable heat. And so they did this on 30 subjects and they randomized them. 15 did it, 15 didn't. All 30 had the jackets on. 15 had it turned on, 15 did not have it turned on, and they watched them. What happens to these patients? Every single endpoint that they looked at was statistically significant. Hey, it's mine! There was a real difference. The group that had the jacket turned on had improvement in their oxygen saturation, could take breaths in more deeply and stronger, had improvements in their blood, white blood cells, and not only that, had improvements in their heart rate, their respiratory rate, all of these statistically significant, but the most important and mind-blowing statistic was the length of stay in the hospital. So, they had these jackets on for 15 minutes once a day for 7 days. In the group that did not have the jacket turned on, their average length of stay was 12 days in the hospital. For those that had the jacket turned on, it was 8 days. That was a 4-day difference. That's tremendous when you realize that it costs thousands of dollars to hospitalize patients. It's a huge amount when you think about the fact that there are certain drugs that get FDA approved for influenza, for instance, by just cutting short the symptoms for 24 hours. This is not just 24 hours, 4 days. People were discharged from the hospital 4 days faster. When I saw that study, that was enough for me to convince me. I mean, obviously it was 30 subjects, right? We should do a bigger study. We should do a couple hundred, right? That would be ideal to do, but the fact that with just 30 patients they could show statistical significance, that was enough for me to say, every patient from now on that I see that comes in with COVID-19 that's hospitalized, that they're asking me to go intubate, to bring to my ICU, these patients are going to get outside. I don't have that jacket that they made in Brazil. I don't even know how I would make that jacket. They made it for the study and it's not commercially available. There's no 940 nanometer light, which is what they did in the study. But I do know this. I do know that sun. And if I could just take these patients outside, maybe they could improve. So I had a patient on the floor. He was on 35 L hour through his high flow, through his nose, barely saturating because he had COVID-19. And I was asked to go see him because he was potentially needing to be intubated or brought to the intensive care unit. I could not believe it because I had not seen one of these in months. So I went down, walked into the room, opened the door. It was in isolation. I had a mask on, the whole 9 yards. The room was completely dark. The blind was closed. His daughter was there, and the first words out of his mouth to me were, "Doc, how much time have I got?" I mean, it was a catastrophe, like there was no light, no circadian rhythm. This guy was depressed. I immediately called my respiratory therapist, immediately called the charge nurse. We got everybody together, and I said, and it was a bright and sunny day. How are we going to get this guy outside? 35 L, 100%. My respiratory therapist, Kim, managed to put a couple of oxygen tanks together, and we were able to get this guy into a wheelchair, and we wheeled him outside. And he, that first day that you got me outside in the sun, 'cause we did this for like 7 days in a row, that felt so good. After just 1 day, he dropped down from 35 L to 15 L, then down to 12, then down to 8 the next day, and then down to 5 days. The amount of oxygen he was inhaling to keep him alive had decreased, correct? So in other words, we were titrating down the amount of oxygen that we had to give him to maintain a saturation in the 90s. In 5 days, he was discharged home without oxygen. Now, obviously, that's an anecdote, right? That's not a study, but I'm looking at the risks of getting people out in the sun for 15, 20 minutes. And if there's a benefit, I thought it was worthwhile doing. We need to have larger randomized controlled trials. But it got me down the road to looking to see what was it about sunlight that was affecting this change. And you know what? There's ample data there. There was a study actually that was done in Europe where they said, okay, here's CO's going up. When does CO goop? Is it because of temperature that changes? Is it because of humidity? And the answers to both of those were no. Do you know what predicted when countries were to have their first surge in the autumn of 2020? There was a study that was actually done on this. It was latitude. It started in Finland and then really went down the entire continent. The last country in the autumn of 2020 to have a COVID surge was Greece. So, as the sun is literally pulling down into the southern hemisphere, as the shadow starts to go over Europe, that's when we start to see CO surges one by one by one. There was yeah. Is that because CO and the sun aren't friends? So it makes it harder to spread. Because, if I put CO on this table, and then I put sunlight on the table, the CO is going to die. Yeah, it's possible. Although we now know that CO probably doesn't spread too much through contact. It's more of an airborne thing. So there was a study that was done out of University of Edinburgh, and they looked at this very question that we had talked about earlier about vitamin D. They looked at the United States in the wintertime. And they eliminated the southern part of the United States because in the southern part of the United States, you can actually get some vitamin D in the wintertime. So they just looked at the northern portion of the United States, and they were able to show that the more sunlight, there was in particular areas, the lower the mortality from CO-19. So they said, this is interesting. What about in England? So they did the exact same study in England, and sure enough, of course, they didn't have to eliminate any part of England because the whole country doesn't get any vitamin D in the wintertime. What they showed was that, again, certain parts of the country in England, as you know, get more sunlight than other parts. Well, those areas that got more sunlight had lower mortality from CO-19. Then they predicated the same study, and they looked in Italy exactly the same finding, and they published this, and they said in their study, and this is what really amazed me. They said the fact if this is causal, they said that this might actually show a possible public health intervention. The fact that it is completely independent of vitamin D means that there's something else going on. There was a study in 2011 in Sweden. Yes, could more sunlight help you live longer? From natural sunlight exposure, being outside using solar radiation data, he was able to show, both from the questionnaires and the geographical sunlight levels where people lived, that the more light exposure individuals had, the lower their risk of overall mortality and cancer mortality. So the question was, does it increase melanoma? What's melanoma? Melanoma is a type of skin cancer, and that's the main risk people worry about when it comes to sunlight exposure. The concern has always been that going out into the sun will increase the chance of getting skin cancer. However, in that massive UK biobank study of about 300,000 to 400,000 participants, Richer found no, you are standing, but there was a clear reduction in non-skin cancer mortality. So here's the trade-off. If you go out into the sun in England, the benefit is a reduction in all other causes of death, non-skin cancer mortality. Theto him, not increase in this study. That finding led Dr. Weller to write and publish an influential op-ed titled Sunlight, Time for a Rethink in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. In it, he argued that global public health messaging needs to change. For decades, we've been told that the sun is a deadly laser and should be avoided at all costs, but evidence now shows we may need to rethink that entirely. Then came the interviewer's question. So are you telling me that essentially 15 minutes in the sun every day turns on a switch in my body that improves my mitochondrial function, which is going to impact a variety of different parts of my health? Is that essentially what you're saying? And the doctor replied, essentially, yes. He went on to explain that we're living in an environment where we spend less and less time outdoors. To put this in perspective, he said, if we were on a British ship 300 years ago and I came to you and said, do you see this little yellow fruit? Just by eating a bit of this, all the diseases your shipmates are suffering from will go away. That would sound incredible. But that's exactly what happened with scurvy. The scurvy of the 21st century is the lack of sunlight. I have with everything now is inside. We avoid the outdoors. We avoid discomfort. We avoid high temperatures, low temperatures. We used to go out and play sports. Now we play virtual sports on screens. We even design our windows, especially here in Southern California, to block infrared light because infrared heats up a room. But in doing so, we're blocking a critical wavelength of sunlight that our biology evolved to need. One of the interesting things we didn't mention about infrared light is the way that we interact with it. You can tell this yourself. Go outside and close your eyes. You can immediately sense which side of your body the sun is on. The reason is that infrared light not only penetrates through your body, it also passes through clothes very easily. The heat that you feel is the infrared light going through your clothes, through your skin, and interacting with your heat receptors. In our humans. Meant to live outside? Host. Right, guys. I'm going to go get Steve. The guest is here. Ready? Come in, Steve. Oh my God, to Steve, what are you doing? Steve, this is the Bond Charge face mask. It's good for blemishes, wrinkles, clears up the skin. It's red light. Have you not tried it before? Host. No, what is it? It's really good. It shines red light on your face, which helps increase and boost gang. I actually found out about it because of my missus. Saw her wearing it. She terrified me a couple of nights in a row. I thought it was to scare people with, but actually it's really good for your skin. Host laughs. So they're a sponsor of the podcast? Steve. Yes, and Bond Charge ships worldwide with easy returns and a year-long warranty on all their products. So, visit bondcharge.com diary for 25% off any product site-wide, but you have to order through that link. That's bondcharge.com diary. Whether you're a novice or you've been in the tax and bookkeeping industry for years, if you want to work with an experienced team of professionals who are invested in your learning and growth, there's a real career opportunity with our sponsor Intuit. The maker of TurboTax and QuickBooks, their self-paced training, Intuit Academy, provides a pathway to gain the necessary skills to feel confident expanding your career within tax and bookkeeping. Their team is extremely supportive, too, with a large network of experienced, credentialed professionals right by your side as you learn and gain experience. On top of all this upskilling, they also offer flexible working schedules. wasintuit.com expert. I'll put that on the screen. That's intuit.com expert. Host. How long does the average American spend indoors? Or the average Brit? Guest. Good question. They're almost identical. I think the Brits spend a little bit more time outside than Americans. The last number for Americans was 93% indoors, and Brits were 92% indoors. Were we born to be outside? Guess I think so. You'd imagine our ancestors probably spent a huge amount of time outside. And when I say outside, that also brings into play a number of other new start letters we haven't talked about, like exercise. You're much more likely to do good exercise outside. Eat. The right kind of air is outside. Another aspect about infrared light, briefly, is that trees are highly reflective of infrared light. If you're in an environment where there are trees present, you'll get much more of this beneficial infrared light than if you're in a concrete jungle. In fact, the way we measure the forestation of the Amazon is through satellite imaging that looks at infrared reflection, because vegetation reflects infrared light back. So the best situation to be in is to be outside, surrounded by greenery. Oh no, we've known for decades that people who live in green spaces do much better in terms of diabetes, hypertension, depression, all of these things. Host. But how do we know it's not just correlation? Maybe people in greener spaces are richer, have better access to healthcare, more time to exercise, etc. Great point. But there's an amazing study that helps answer that. It's called the Green Heart Study in South Louisville, Kentucky. They did something extraordinary. They took a 4-square-mile urban area in South Louisville and measured everybody's HSCRP, high-sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation correlated. They measured about 700 people. Then they did something amazing. They purchased and planted 8,000 mature trees across that 4-square-mile area, trees with leaves already on them. 2 years later, they went back and remeasured all 700 people. The results? Their HSCRP levels dropped by 13–20%, which correlated to about a 10 to 15% reduction. These people didn't change their socioeconomic status. The only major change was the addition of trees. Institute an exercise program. And so really it kind of shoots in the heart. The idea that the advantage that we see with green spaces has to do with something else that we're not measuring. How to get infrared light on a cloudy day. I actually believe that we'll talk about fresh air too, that things like these plants, but much bigger. This is kind of like a bonsai plant, but trees outside, they actually have a benefit. And what they represent again is these things that don't leverage the other parts of your body in terms of the chains that make all of the chains bigger because they're having a benefit. But you can't get the benefit of this if you're inside a house. So what should we do about this in terms of what changes should I make in my life to capitalize on this? This brand here is called Bon Charge. They do these red light devices. They do like red light saunas, blankets, masks. They're actually a sponsor of mine because I started wearing this and I think they found out and I started wearing it because of my girlfriend. Yeah, she was wearing it every day and I got curious. And so as I always do, I'm always super skeptical. Sure. So I went online and started looking at some of the research and I was shocked. Yeah, it made no intuitive sense to me that a red light mask or any like red light device could have a profound what I see as a profound impact on my health. Like I didn't believe it. Yes. To start with, it was like woo-woo stuff. To me, I couldn't disprove it. Right. All the studies, many of which you've referenced, supported that it was having a profound impact. And as I've said on this podcast before, my girlfriend's always right. She's like always ahead of the curve, always right. So I started wearing her mask, and now I have my own from Bon Charge. Yeah. Do you recommend these kinds of things? I think it's reasonable to do. I will say this. If you are getting enough infrared light from the sun, what we find in studies, not particularly with the mask, but we find in other things is that these other areas don't have as much efficacy. It's almost to say if you're on a ship with a bunch of people with scurvy and you already have a diet that's rich in vegetables and fruits, eating an extra lemon is not going to be that beneficial. So what do? Like a lot of doctors do, we have shifts that go from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So you're in the hospital, you're not going to get outside. So at lunch, I try to get outside as much as I possibly can into the sun for my 15 minutes. What if you live in a cloudy country? So that's a good point. Clouds, because they are water molecules, will absorb a lot of the infrared light. And the problem is that that's exactly the type of light that you want to get. However, even on a cloudy day, being outside, you're going to get more. Guessed. Infrared light than if you were inside. Okay, so I still get the light I need when it's cloudy, but I just don't get a lot? Guessed. Yes, exactly. Host. Is there anything I can do if it's super cloudy and I know I'm going to be indoors? What do I do then? Guessed. Yeah. So the type of lights that we have inside, like these ones, and actually, I think the UK and the United States are very similar in this regard, is that we really can't get the old incandescent bulbs anymore. We're now on LED or fluorescent. And if you think about what they've done with these bulbs, the old incandescent bulbs used to give you a very broad spectrum of light, all the way from near blue down into the infrared. But the way they've made modern bulbs more energy efficient, they said, hey, let's stop using energy to give off this light that we can't see, and instead only give off a narrow band of visible light. So think about what they've done. For the first time in human history. Whenever in human history, whether lighting a candle, going outside into sunlight, or using a kerosene lamp, we were always getting full spectrum light. In other words, is getting blue light without red light, and blue light without red light. Host. So should I change my bulbs? Guest. It's difficult to do that because you can't easily pick up incandescent bulbs anymore. At least in the United States, there are now laws that of incandescent bulbs for energy efficiency reasons. 2. Oh yeah, I'm on Google now and I've typed in incandescent bulb, G. So there's something called a general service lamp. That's the type of bulb you could plug in. But if you want to get a bulb for your microwave or a special chandelier, those are still available because they're considered specialty bulbs. You can still get incandescent bulbs for those uses. H. What about these kinds of bulbs? Is that an incandescent bulb? Guessed. That is an incandescent bulb, again for those special types of lights. But I'm talking about the good old-fashioned A90I now, Glenn Jeffrey. And this is a preprint study he's done, not yet peer-reviewed or published, but available online. Actually tested this. He took 22 people working in environments with LED bulbs, then switched them out for incandescent bulbs. The result, there was a 25% improvement in color differentiation in his study. To what does that mean? Guessed. It means they were able to distinguish colors, too, when exposed to incandescent light compared to LED. When I say LED bulbs, I'm referring to those high in the blue light spectrum. Guessed. Why would that be? Well, tremendously metabolically active. They're constantly updating, sending neural signals to the brain. It's one of the tissues in the body with the highest concentration of mitochondria, because it needs a lot of energy. As people get older, those mitochondria don't produce as much energy, which means the cones can't perform their job as well. So, if you could somehow increase the energy output from those mitochondria, you might improve visual performance. And Glenn Jeffrey has already done a study where he exposed people's eyes to 670 nanometer red light. Try 3 minutes in the morning, and it improved their ability to visualize and see. And what does that mean for the broader picture of our health? Guessed. It means they were able to distinguish colors better and improve. That's basically it. But it also ties back to your very first question from the beginning of the podcast. What is the effect of low energy output from mitochondria? Well, it depends on which tissue the mitochondria are in. If it's in the eye, it affects visual perception. If it's in the bee, it affects dementia. So we start to realize that a myriad of different diseases are affected by sunlight. Guessed. I challenge anyone to look this up. If you find publications in the United States that map the number of deaths per day throughout the year, for cardiac disease, respiratory disease, kidney disease, pneumonia, infectious and non-infectious diseases, you'll see a very clear pattern. The maximum every year occurs within a month after the shortest day of the year, December to January. We see the most influenza deaths at that time, with cardiac deaths at that time, in kidney deaths at that time. So you might ask, well, that's because guess people get together at Christmas time and they spread the germs around more. And we have Thanksgiving in late November here in the United States. And that's what's going on. The problem is, if you look at Australia, which is on the other end, when is their longest day of the year? Their longest day of the year is in optimal time of day to get sunlight. And that's when they have the least amount of deaths, despite the fact that they're all getting together for Christmas in December. Soup. The most amount of deaths in Australia, in the southern hemisphere, occur in June to July. That's their winter. So what you see is that deaths are correlated to the length of the day. This is the reason why, whenever they show you annual mortality data, they always have to seasonally adjust it. And the which is essentially a proxy for the amount of sunlight. Absolutely, you're much more likely to get sunlight on the longest day of the year, yes, shortest day of the year, especially for people who are doing shift work. December and January, when you literally you're going off to work before the sun rises, and you're coming home after the sun has long set. So you could go literally hostess guest. Yes, so the optimal time of day to get sunlight for those concerned about ultraviolet radiation is when the sun is that's because UV light cannot penetrate obliquely through the atmosphere as well as long wavelength radiation can. So when the sun is coming up in the morning or going down in the evening, that's when you'll get proportionally more infrared light and the least amount of ultraviolet light. When the sun is directly overhead at noon, you'll get the most infrared light So if you're not someone who's used to going out in the sun a lot, you may want to avoid that midday period, or, as we talked about, wear a broad-rimmed hat, protective clothing, etc. Because, as we said earlier, ultraviolet light does not penetrate through clothes very well. But infrared light can, H, does it matter where the sun is hitting my body? Guessed. It host. So if I go outside and I'm wearing a big hat, obviously it's covering my eyes and my face, yes, it'll be hitting my legs. Guessed. For the purposes of what we're talking about with the me, it will not matter. However, if we're talking about circadian rhythm, that's different. For circadian rhythm, the pathway is through the eyes. So you want to maximize light exposure through the eyes. So this type of light is called a SAD light for seasonal affective disorder. Your question has to do with what part of the body it needs to touch. For the mitochondrial and metabolic effects, it doesn't matter which body part. But for the circadian rhythm effect, it's a completely different system that's governed by your eye and the brain, which regulates when various biological processes occur. Benefits of SAD light therapy. This light, the SAD light, is about 10,000 lux. Lux is a way of measuring the brightness of light, and what studies have shown is that when you shine this type of light into your eyes, it helps adjust your circadian rhythm. You know how if you have a clock that's not set to the right time, there's that little thing at the back you pull out to reset it? Light exposure works the same way for your body. It resets the timing of your internal clock. Light can actually shift yes one way or the other. Deepen you shine it. If you shine the light in the morning, which is set your circadian rhythm and keep it on track, it also helps reduce depression. There's a part of your brain that receives light information called the perihabenular nucleus contribute to depression. So, for people who live at high latitudes, closer to the poles, where the sun rises very late in the morning and they're already at work indoors, this can be very beneficial. What I would recommend is you can pick these lights up fairly cheaply, about $20 on Amazon. They should generally be about 11 to 16 inches from your face, 1,000 lux hours from, and what I mean by lux hours is that you multiply the brightness, lux, by the number of hours that you're wearing it. So 3,000 is where you ought to be. Because this is 10,000 lux, you only have to look at it for about a third of an hour or 20 minutes, and that should be enough. So is this a replacement for going outside? It's a replacement for going outside because of the fact that you're living at a very high latitude and the sun is not up, and because of the job that you have, it's going to have that effect. But realize that this will not replace the effect that the sun has on your mitochondria. This is only to affect the effect that lack of sunlight has on depression. Okay? So what if I'm looking at the sun out of a window? It depends on the window. So you're not still, the window is going to be reducing the amount of luck. So I would not recommend, if you can, I would not say that staying inside looking out the window is the same as going outside. That's number one. The other thing that you have to understand is a lot of these windows, especially if they're modern windows, will be specifically designed to reduce infrared light. I want you to give any information you have as it relates to light health. Yeah, that will improve my life. Things that I can actionably do tomorrow. Obviously, one of them is that I'm going to go outside and make sure I get some sunlight. Ideally in the morning, yes. We talked about this SAD lamp for people, especially that live in certain countries which have less sunlight. Correct. To set their circadian rhythm and to help with things like mental health. Is there anything else I should be thinking about or can do or change? Yes. So just like we had in our mnemonic of new start, rest and exercise both at the same time and that yet they're sort of like opposite of each other. It's important to have darkness, okay? It's important to have darkness. And this is a real issue. This is one of the biggest issues is the fact there was a study that was published recently and the title was Dark Days and Bright Nights. And that correlated with increased mortality. That's how most of us live. That's the problem. We have dark days and we have bright nights. And what we really should be having is bright days and dark nights. So, just as important as it is to have bright sunlight and getting outside in the middle of the day, we also need to start working on getting darker nights as well. And how do we do that? Turning things off. Why should we avoid bright screens at night? Screens away from our eyes. These are really important because the screens have a lot of light, and the light, what's going on here? This is the reason why it's important. There's two reasons, actually, is the light that's going into our eyes is doing two things at night. Number one, it is shutting down melatonin production from the pineal gland. And as we just talked about, melatonin is a very powerful antioxidant that's very beneficial. The second thing that it's doing is it's confusing your circadian rhythm. You see, your circadian rhythm is designed to see light as day. If your eyes are seeing light, your brain thinks it's the day. So if it's 10 hours at night and your eyes are seeing light, your circadian rhythm is saying, I must have made a mistake. I thought it was 10 o'clock. It must not be 10 o'clock because look, there is light. And so what it's going to do is it's going to adjust itself and delay everything because it's saying, well, it can't be 10 out at night. It must be 6 hours. And so therefore, when you would normally feel tired and sleepy at 10 hours at night, after a number of days of doing this, you're not going to feel sleepy until 1 in the morning. These devices we have, they spit out a lot of blue light, right? Yes. Is there a way to turn that off effectively? Well, actually, a lot of these come with tied to the clock, where after a certain time of night, it will shift its spectrum to a more red spectrum. So it's giving you less blue light. The problem is that while the sensor in your eyes are tuned more to blue light, it's not just blue light. So really the best solution is to turn off the light. The next best solution is to have more of a red shift where, put these glasses on at night. So these are blue blockers. They're trying to eliminate blue, but I'm still getting light in. And that's enough light to shut down melatonin production. So even with those on? Yeah, absolutely. But you're telling me these help? They're better than not turning off the light. And you're saying I still get light in because there's light coming over the top. Even that light there is still going to bleed and it's going to bleed into that part of the spectrum and cause melatonin to be shut down. Yeah. So, it's just the eyes are the barometer. For should the bedroom be completely dark at night? Correct what time of day it is. Correct. And the problem is that even when you close your lids, light can still get through the lids. What do you think of these sleep masks? I think they're great in terms of the fact that we now know that closing your eyelids still can allow some light to go in. So, if you're sleeping in an environment where, light is out of your control, if you're living in the city and you can close your blinds, but there's still light that's coming in. These things could actually be very arms, one with omega fatty acids and one with vitamin D. And they showed that in the vitamin D group, there was a statistically significant reduction in autoimmune conditions. I personally supplement with vitamin D, and if you are going to supplement, you should get your blood levels checked. Why? Because vitamin D is a F, meaning it can accumulate in your body. It's possible, though rare, to take too much. If you oversupplement, it can disrupt calcium metabolism, the high calcium, hypercalcemia, which can affect your kidneys and other systems. That said, I don't want this to discourage people from taking vitamin D. Supplementation can be very beneficial. Monitor your levels periodically. Your body's needs for vitamin D also depend on vitamin D skin color. People with darker skin need more sunlight to produce the same amount. Latitude, less UV exposure at higher latitudes, especially in winter. So, for example, if you're living in the UK, your skin will make less vitamin D than someone living near the equator, and you'll need either more outdoor time or supplementation. What does vitamin D actually do? Vitamin D affects many systems in your body. Structurally, it's a lipid-soluble molecule, which means it can pass through cell membranes and enter the cell where it binds to receptors and influences gene transcription. In other words, it can turn genes on or off depending on the cell type. So regular supporting immune function, there are vitamin D receptors on immune cells, reducing inflammation, influencing muscle strength and mood. Globally, about 1 billion people are vitamin D deficient, and around 50% of the world's population has insufficient levels. As societies have become more industrialized, people spend less time outdoors, life temperature-controlled environments, and So, even though we've advanced technologically, we've also moved further away from the natural light exposure our biology evolved to depend on. And that's having a real impact on our immune systems, sleep quality, mental health, and longevity that are too hot or too cold. And so what do? We stay inside. We stay in this nice, comfortable, temperature-controlled environment. But the problem is, when we stay indoors, we are blocking sunlight. And that sunlight is crucial for vitamin D synthesis. The UVB radiation the more time we spend inside, the less vitamin D we produce naturally. And that's really the paradox of modern life. The more developed and comfortable our societies become, the less exposure we get to the very environmental factors, like sunlight, that our biology depends on for optimal health. That's why we're now seeing vitamin D deficiency even in places where sunshine is abundant. People simply aren't, or the covered up, sunscreen all the time. So, to summarize, vitamin D is critical for bone health, immune regulation, and gene expression. Most people are deficient of supplementation helps, blood testing to avoid overdosing. And ideally, we should all be spending more time outdoors, beds. Too hot. We don't like things too cold. Well, let's face it, in our cars, we have something called climate control. We can set the temperature, and that's what the temperature is going to be. There's other implications which we can talk about in terms of hydrotherapy, perhaps, if we get to that. But the issue is we don't like those extremes. We don't like going out into the sun, and when we don't do that, we suffer the consequences. Is there a way for me to get vitamin D without supplementation and without going into the sun? Yes, it's in certain foods as well. Mushrooms, for instance. Certain types of fish. They have vitamin D in them as well. This is a strange question, but do you think our body knows do cravings signal nutrient deficiencies? Which foods we're deficient in? And really what I'm saying there is if I'm vitamin D deficient, do you think there's a part of my body that knows that I need to eat mushrooms? It's a good question. And that makes me hungry for mushrooms. I don't know about that particularly. I can say this, though. In people who don't get enough sleep, we tend to have a predilection to eating more carbohydrate-rich foods. That one we do know. Okay. And this is the reason why many scientists believe that people who don't get enough sleep tend to have food choices that tend to put weight on. Every single one of you watching, this right now has something to offer, whether it's knowledge or skills or experience. And that means you have value. Stand the platform. I co-own, who are one of the sponsors of this podcast, turns your knowledge into a business through one single click. You can sell digital products, coaching, communities, and you don't need any coding experience either. Just the drive to start. This is a business I really believe in. And already $300 million has been earned by creators, coaches, and entrepreneurs just like you have the potential to be on Stan's store. These are people who didn't wait, who heard me saying things like this, and instead of procrastinating, started building, then launched something, and now they're getting paid to do it. Stan is incredibly simple and incredibly easy, and you can link it with a Shopify store that you're already using if you want to. I'm on it, and so is my girlfriend and many of my team. So, if you want to join, start by launching your own business with a free 30-day trial. Visit stephenbartlett.stan.store and get yours set up within minutes. Water's role in the body of. These cards that we have left in front of us from the New Start framework. Which one are you compelled to talk about next? Water. Water. Yeah. Okay. So, tell me what you mean by water. Because people will think, yeah, I drink enough water. Well, first of all, I don't think we do drink enough water. But what everyone talks about, the internal use of water, and it makes sense. But as I was talking about before, the external use of water can actually be very impressive, and it has to do with body temperature, and it has to do with the immune system. So we'll talk about water, but let's sort of set the framework for that conversation. Your immune system is broken up into two types. There's the innate immune system and the adaptive. We've become very familiar with the adaptive immune system during COVID because all of the talk was about antibodies and antigens, and the fact that SARS-CoV-2 was mutating and would the vaccines that made antibodies against them be still functional. All of that where we literally have a key with a keyhole that it fits into and turns the lock and these antibodies and they fit. That's all the adaptive immune system. It's very important, but it completely eliminates or removes from discussion the innate immune system. The innate immune system is really the body's first defense. And what's happening there is there's these cells that are circulating, Cells like monocytes and natural killer cells and a number of other cells which scour the body always looking for something that looks foreign to it. And it can tell based on the molecular patterns of these invaders that they're not supposed to be there and they should be eaten up. Interferons and the innate immune system. The major actor of this innate immune system is something called interferon. Interferon is a very important molecule in the body, and it is effective. It is so effective at preventing viral infections that just about every single viral infection that plagues the human body today has a defense mechanism against interferon. It is a prerequisite. There's no self-respecting virus that can think that it can infect the human body without dealing with the issue of interferon. Period. Think about interferon as the security guard at the bank. And if you want to rob a bank, you've got to have a plan for how you're going to deal with the security guard. Otherwise, you're not getting the money. Does that make sense? Yeah. So there was actually an article that was published a couple years ago where they talked about this battle between interferon and emerging viruses and what viruses are doing to try to get around interferon. You may recall that back in 2002, we had an outbreak of something called SARS, which especially was pretty bad in China, but also in Canada. The reason why we were able to secure that outbreak was because that everybody who came down with SARS developed a fever, and so it was easy to the fever, we'll feel better. But what we're actually doing is we're cutting the legs out from our immune system because part of the immune system's response is to generate a fever, and the fever itself stimulates the production of interferon. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but let's compare the innate immune system to adaptive. The adaptive immune system is very specific. It targets a particular variant of a virus. For viruses that mutate rapidly, like SARS-CoV-2, the immune response from vaccination or previous infection may be less effective over time because the virus's structure changes. That's why we saw different variants like Alpha, Delta, and Omicron, and why the immune response had to adapt to each one. However, for the innate immune system, so bringing this back to water, here's where things get interesting. Water has a very high specific heat, which means it can hold and transfer heat efficiently. When we apply hot water to the human body, for example through saunas, hot baths, or hot compresses, we can safely raise the body's temperature. This mild, controlled heating mimics nature, prompting the body to produce more interferon and other immune molecules, effectively strengthening our natural defenses. In other words, by using hydrotherapy without actually being sick. This is why practices like sauna bathing and contrast therapy, hot-cold exposure, are associated with better immune health and lower infection rates. The fever will feel better. But what we're actually doing is we're cutting the legs out from our immune system because part of the immune system response is to generate a fever, and the fever generates interferon. Now, I don't want to overstate this, but let's compare the innate immune system to the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system is pretty specific for a particular variant of a virus. And for a virus that mutates very rapidly like SARS-CoV-2, the immunization may be very good in terms of binding. But if that virus mutates, that binding is going to be affected. In some way, it may not affect hospitalization, but maybe in terms of preventing infection, you understand what I'm saying? So the different variants. We had the Alpha variant, then we had the Delta variant, then we had Omicron, etc. Those are material changes for the adaptive of the immune system. For the innate immune system, for interferon, it doesn't matter. Interferon is just as effective against Alpha as it was for Delta as it would be for Omicron. So let's set this up again. Water, we said that water has a very high specific heat, which means that if importance of hydration for fighting infections, apply hot water onto the human body. It's able to transfer heat. This is why people can get burned with boiling. We don't obviously want to burn anybody, but if we're able to put them into a sauna, if we're able to put them into a spa, if we're able to use hot towels and apply to the human body to heat up their body to cause a sweat, in other words, if we're able to induce artificial fevers in patients who have these infections, there seems to be evidence that the interferon response will be better. There was a study that was done looking at lymphocytes and taking them out of the human body and at different temperatures once it hit about 38, 39 degrees, there was off the charts a 10-10-fold increase in interferon, which is exactly what you would want to have. Now, how do I know that interferon levels are so important in things like COVID-19? Well, there was a study that was done that showed that high levels of interferon correlated with more mildew-H, SARS-CoV-2 infections, and that people that had low interferon levels had very severe COVID-19 infections. So, you suggesting that we should be in the sauna more often? Yes. And it's based on data that has been well documented in the Finnish sauna realm. So people who use sauna 4, 5, 6, 7 times a week are more likely to have less death from cardiovascular disease than people house sauna once a week. And in Finland, once a week is kind of the standard. And why do they say to do hot and cold? Should we use hot and cold therapy together? To the idea of combining heat and cold therapy goes back more than a century, supported by several early scientific papers. When you expose your body to heat, for example, spending around 20 minutes in a sauna, the goal is to raise your core body temperature. This thermal stress activates several beneficial physiological responses. At the end of the heat session, applying brief cold exposure, like a short cold shower or plunge, serves 2 main purposes. Vasocons. Cold exposure causes your surface blood vessels to constrict. This temporary narrowing of the vessels reduces heat loss through the skin, helping your core body temperature remain elevated for longer, ironically keeping you warmer after leaving the sauna. Demarcate in white blood cells, immune cells, are demargination. Once released, they can move throughout the body and perform immune functions such as fighting infections. So, ending a heat session with a short cold exposure, even just 1 minute, not only prolongs elevated core temperature but also stimulates immune activation through white blood cell mobilization. Impact of tree aromas on immunity. Next, let's talk about air. Air through roll call, but also through beneficial nature. Research has shown that trees and plants release phytoncides, natural aromatic compounds that interact positively with the human body. These compounds can enhance immune function and promote relaxation. In Japan, extensive studies have been conducted on this phenomenon, especially in the hinoki cypress forests. Research bodies were taken from their offices into these forests for nature walks. Their natural killer, NK cells, key composes, increased in number and activity. The enzymes inside NK cells that destroy viruses and diseased cells also became more active, even when these individuals later stayed in city hotels. Simply infusing the air with phytoncides replicated almost the same immune-boosting effects. Remarkably, this enhanced immune response lasted about 7 days after just 1 day of exposure in the forest. This spending even 1 day a week in nature can so the benefits of being outdoors go far beyond fresh air or exercise. Trees don't just clean the air, they also release natural chemicals that strengthen the body's defenses. Indoor air and carbon dioxide levels now. Let's shift to indoor air quality. Spending long hours indoors, especially in poorly ventilated rooms, carbon dioxide, CO2, to accumulate. Elevated CO2 levels have been shown to impair cognitive performance, reduce alertness, and cause fatigue. Many people who work in studios or offices experience this without realizing it. For example, one podcast studio began in a small, enclosed space without air conditioning, and over time, CO2 built up from exhaled air, reducing mental sharpness. Dr. Jafram rarely demonstrated this clearly. Using a CO2 meter, he showed that this lowered indoor CO2 levels. How to optimize indoor air quality. Open a window or door slightly whenever possible, ensuring safety and comfort. Valves, especially in enclosed spaces like offices, hotel rooms, or cars. Roll down car windows briefly to release trapped CO2 during long drives. Use air purifiers or indoor plants to help improve oxygen levels. The key indicator of poor indoor air quality is rising CO2 concentration, so maintaining airflow is crucial for both physical health and mental performance. Summary factor mechanism key. Benefits hot-cold therapy. Heat raises body temperature. Cold triggers vasoconstriction and white blood cell release, improves circulation, enhances immune response tree. Phytoncides, nature boosts NK cell activity. lowers stress, effects last up to 7 days, fresh air and low CO2 valve improves focus, brain function, and overall well-being. Optimizing indoor air and carbon dioxide levels when driving, it's important to turn off the air recirculation button. Leaving it on means you're continuously breathing the same air, causing carbon dioxide, CO2 levels to rise. Some people even avoid staying in certain hotel rooms if the windows can't be opened, which is common in high-rise buildings. Fresh air circulation is essential for maintaining alertness and preventing fatigue. In smaller studio environments, like the one we use in the UK, we've found affordable CO2 monitors on Amazon that can be placed on the floor to track air quality. They're not expensive and are useful for anyone spending long hours indoors. He mentions linking these devices for viewers interested in checking the CO2 levels in their own workspace. Faith as a way to cope with stress and anxiety. Moving on, while many people discuss physical health pillars such as exercise, nutrition, and self-control, far fewer talk about trust or faith. Spice religious faith, or trust in a higher power often provides a framework for dealing with stress and anxiety. A number of studies have examined how trust in God correlates with people who have a strong, supportive faith, one that emphasizes love, forgiveness, and acceptance, tend to experience lower and belonging to a faith community as members, which contributes to resilience during difficult times. While the scientific evidence in this area is largely correlational, not necessarily proving causation, the associations are strong and consistent, but psychological pillars that helps people maintain emotional stability. Condition. A fascinating study by Krauss et al. From the University of Texas explored the connection between forgiveness style and mental health. Researchers surveyed participants about their forgiveness tendencies and divided them into two groups. Conditional forgiveness, forgiving only if the offender apologizes or makes amends. Unconditional forgiveness, regardless of whether the offender seeks forgiveness or expresses regret. Results. Individuals who practiced unconditional forgiveness had lower levels of depression and anxiety, fewer feelings, less fear related to death or end-of-life issues. In contrast, those who forgave conditionally tended to experience more somatic symptoms of depression. Real, measurable physical effects confirmed through validated psychological assessments. What determines how we forgive? Researchers wanted to understand why some people forgive unconditionally while others do not. They analyzed multiple possible factors, but only one stood out significantly, with an odds ratio of about 2.5. The single strongest predictor of unconditional forgiveness was whether a person believed God had forgiven them. In other words, people who felt forgiven by God were 5 times more likely to forgive others unconditionally. That mindset, in turn, was associated with less depression, less anxiety, and better overall mental health. This finding suggests that a sense of divine forgiveness may foster emotional healing and psychological resilience. Faith-integrated cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. There have even been randomized controlled trials. Faith-based elements can enhance traditional psychotherapy. In people who already hold religious beliefs, when faith-aligned concepts such as forgiveness, trust in God, or spiritual purpose are integrated into cognitive behavioral therapy, the treatment becomes more effective at reducing symptoms of anxiety and depression compared to standard CBT alone. Summary concept core. Idea key findings faith-P associated. With lower rates of depression and anxiety, hook forgiving, without needing an apology or compensation linked. To better mental and emotional health by feeling forgiven by God leads to more unconditional forgiveness. Faith integrated. Therapy mix shown to improve treatment. Outcomes in believers, respect and consent in spiritual. Practice when it comes to faith and prayer, especially in a healthcare setting, consent. For example, as a healthcare worker, you shouldn't buy, if someone doesn't believe, I don't go and pray for them without asking. This is something that always has to be done with permission. Faith can be a powerful source of comfort, but it should never be forced upon others. Are people who believe in God generally healthier? There is a significant amount of research exploring whether religious belief or faith in God correlates with better health outcomes. What overall? Studies have shown that people who maintain a healthy relationship with their faith community and with God tend to be associated with lower rates of disease and better overall health. However, this relationship is correlational, not necessarily causal. It's difficult to determine whether people who are already healthier and more socially connected are more likely to engage in religion, or whether religious involvement itself directly contributes to improved well-being. Still, it appears that belief in a higher power, deep sense of calm and emotional stability in faith, lifestyle, and health across religions. Many religions have long integrated healthy lifestyle principles into their spirit. For instance, Hinduism encourages early rising and greeting the morning sun. Why Islam included "Are you fasting?" Many faiths throughout history have incorporated hot-cold rituals. These parallels suggest that religious traditions often carry embedded wisdom about physical and mental wellness. When faith becomes unhealthy, on the other hand, research also shows that an unhealthy or fear-based view of God can have negative psychological effects. If someone believes in a vindictive or punitive deity, a God who is constantly watching to punish or condemn, this belief can increase anxiety, guilt, and stress. So, the type of relationship one has with their faith or God matters greatly. A loving, trusting relationship tends to promote peace and health. A fearful, punitive relationship can contribute to emotional suffering. Witnessing death in healthcare practice and medical practice, healthcare professionals often witness death firsthand, sometimes even being sometimes I'm the last person they see. It makes you realize that death is inevitable. In medicine, all we really do is delay the inevitable. The goal in healthcare, therefore, isn't to defeat death, but to ensure that when death comes, it happens with dignity. This means to supporting families and celebrated rather than merely focusing on their final moments. What's up? When people approach death, they often become very reflective and open. T. Relationships, forgiveness. P. The meaning of their lives. These experiences often remind caregivers and families alike of the importance of compassion, acceptance, and living with purpose. Summary. Theme key insight, impact faith and health B promotes mental and physical well-being, lifestyle and religion. Many faith traditions naturally include healthy habits. Fasting, sunlight reflection, supports longevity and vitality. Toxic faith. Fear-based beliefs can harm mental health. End-of-life care medicine can't prevent death, but can preserve dignity. Encourages compassion and respect. Spiritual consent, prayer, or faith practices require permission. Upholds ethical and emotional integrity. Reflections on death and patient choice. End of life experiences are deeply personal and vary greatly from one individual to another. Some people become very introspective and thoughtful as they approach death. Over time, I've witnessed a wide range of responses, from people who fear death to those who seem completely at peace with it. There are patients who feel they've fulfilled their purpose in life and are ready to let go. As healthcare providers, we're often trained to fight death, to use every available intervention, whether it's a ventilator, medication, or another form of life support. But it can be surprising how often relatively stable patients, facing a condition that could be treated, will calmly say, "No, I don't want that. I choose not to have any further treatment," and we have to respect that choice. Of course, our responsibility is to educate them and ensure that they understand all the options and consequences. But ultimately, once patients are fully informed, the decision belongs to them. In essence, I've seen people consciously choose death rather than accept artificial means of prolonging life, and that decision deserves just as much respect as the choice to fight for more time. A miraculous story. Recovery from anoxic brain injury. There was one case early in my medical training that changed me profoundly, not because it was tragic, but because it was, in every sense, a miracle. It taught me humility and reminded me to never play the role of a prognosticating physician, the kind who tells patients or families, "You'll never walk again," or "You only have 2 years to live." That kind of certainty simply doesn't belong in medicine, because sometimes the impossible happens. The case: a young man in his 20s underwent successful surgery for testicular cancer. However, during the operation, something went wrong. His brain was deprived of oxygen, resulting in a severe anoxic brain injury. When he came out of surgery, he was unresponsive, his body constantly trembling, his eyes rolling without focus. He was placed on a ventilator in the ICU, where I was working as a resident under the supervision of senior attending physicians. Every day we made rounds, and each day it was the same. No improvement, no sign of consciousness. The neurologist reviewed his scans and confirmed the worst. This patient is not going to wake up. The wife's faith. The young man's wife, also in her 20s, came to the hospital every single day. She refused to believe that her husband would remain in this state forever. She would talk to him, hold his hand, adjust his blankets, and sometimes bring homemade herbal mixtures that she asked us to add to his tube feeding. We let her do small things to comfort him, but privately, most of us thought she was in denial. The attending physicians would shake their heads and say, "She doesn't understand. He's never going to wake up." Then one morning, she arrived at the hospital smiling radiantly, calm and full of peace. Through a translator, they were a Hispanic couple, she told us, "I had a dream last night. In the dream, he was coming home. He's going to wake up." We tried to be kind, but quietly dismissed it. Still, her faith was unshakable. The miracle weeks passed. One day during morning rounds, I glanced into his room. He was still lying there, trembling. But this time, something was different. His eyes seemed to focus for the first time. I raised my hand instinctively as if to wave, and to my astonishment, he raised his hand too, and he froze. "He just waved?" I said. We rushed into the room to assess him, and sure enough, he was beginning to respond. From that day forward, tiny improvements with after months of rehabilitation. The unthinkable happened. About 6 months later, he and his wife returned to the unit, smiling and healthy. He was walking completely on his own, carrying a large basket of flowers to thank the entire ICU staff for caring for him. I reflected. For most of the time, he was in our care. The medical team was simply keeping him alive, or no one truly expected recovery. Yet, against every medical prediction, he came back. That experience changed me permanently. It made me realize that medicine doesn't have all the answers. But it was nothing short of a miracle. Lessons learned. Never assume certainty when it comes to human life. Hope, faith, and love can operate in ways medicine can't fully explain. Doctors can estimate outcomes, but only life itself determines the final result. What I think that young man had who believed in him wholeheartedly, and something beyond the physical and mental took place. Perhaps it was spiritual, perhaps something we don't yet understand. It's extremely rare when things like this happen, but they do. And when they do, it's almost always in younger people, those whose brains and bodies still have remarkable resilience. That's what the scientific side of my mind would say. But the other part of me, the part that recognizes the limits of human knowledge, says this: I probably know 5 to 10% of medical science, which itself is only a fraction of all the world's knowledge. That means there's an enormous amount, 80% or 90%, that we simply don't know. So if that experience taught me anything, it's that we must stay humble about what we think we know. There are things we know, and things we don't even know that we don't know. Melatonin and sleep. Benefits and cautions. We talked earlier about melatonin, and I wanted to close the loop on that topic. Many people take melatonin supplements at night too, I would say. They can be good in specific situations. If someone has trouble falling asleep, a small dose, no more than 5 milligrams, can be helpful. Mel's, especially if it's been delayed and needs to move earlier. It's particularly effective for throat and a few sleep-related disorders. However, I don't recommend taking large doses regularly without a medical reason. Why? Because every substance, even natural ones, has trade-offs and side effects. High doses of melatonin can make you more irritable. 1,000. And there's also speculation that excessive use could reduce the pineal gland's natural melatonin production. Bringing it all together, the chain of health. We've covered a lot today: exercise, nutrition, sleep, faith, and mindset. but they're all connected by one simple truth. The human body and mind work like a chain, and our health depends on the strength of every link. Medications have their place, especially in emergencies or at the end of life, when the goal is to sustain life temporarily. But if your goal is longevity and vitality, strengthening every link, lifestyle, relationships, purpose, sleep, nutrition, and faith. That's what I call New Start, an acronym that stands for nutrition, exercise, water, sunlight, temperance, air, rest, and trust. These are the foundations of lasting wellness. Final question. What I'm rarely asked but most passionate about on this podcast. There's a tradition. Each guest leaves a question for the next, not knowing who it will be. The key. What is the area of your focus that you're most passionate about, but almost never asked about? My answer is simple: the Bible and the evidence of science within it. Science reflected in the Bible. Throughout our discussion, we've explored the human body and health. I'm deeply fascinated by how ancient biblical statements often contain profound scientific. From before, for instance, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit?" That's an extraordinary metaphor. But what does it mean scientifically? At that time, the only temple was the one in Jerusalem, built according to the divine instructions given to Moses. So I decided to study those biblical passages, particularly Exodus 25-30, which painstakingly describes the structure of the temple. Then I asked, if Paul says the human body is a temple, could the physical structure of the temple correspond to the biological structure of the human body, even though ancient people had no medical knowledge of anatomy? It turns out the parallels are astonishing. In the human body, blood circulates through vessels and flows into interstitial fluid. In each cell is surrounded by a membraneth. Inside each cell are two main compartments, the sea and the nucleus, two inner chambers of the temple, the holy place and not. The resemblance is remarkable, especially considering that cellular biology and circulation were completely unknown until the 1600s, centuries after these scriptures were written. Closing thought. Should hospital patients be taken outside? All of this ties back to one simple question. Are we respecting the full design of life, physical, mental, and spiritual? Even in hospitals, simple things like fresh air, sunlight, and nature life matter. Maybe the wisdom in these ancient principles isn't just metaphorical. Maybe it's deeply biological too. In the wilderness, Moses was given a very specific design for the temple. Interestingly, Hindu temples are also built with a similar three-part structure. The temple begins with the altar of sacrifice, which represents blood, just like blood in the human body. Next comes the laver, a basin of water, symbolizing the interstitial space where fluid exchange occurs between blood and cells. After that, there is a structure separated by a veil that cannot be penetrated unless one passes through it. This mirrors the cell membrane. The temple itself is like a body, and this inner chamber within a chamber represents the nucleus within the cell. Inside this first room of the temple are various pieces of furniture that parallel organelles found within the cytoplasm. For instance, the 7-branched candlestick that burns olive oil to produce light and energy resembles the mitochondria, where beta-oxidation generates energy in the body. Finally, one enters the most sacred area, the most holy place, which houses the Ark of the Covenant, famously depicted in Indiana Jones' Raiders of the Lost Ark. INSEE. This perfectly parallels what happens within the human nucleus, which contains 2 strands of DNA. On these DNA strands is the genetic code, the code of life. When that code is altered or broken, mutations occur, leading to disease and death. None of this was known until the 1950s when DNA was discovered. Yet Paul wrote in the Bible nearly 2,000 years earlier, "Your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit." I find that fascinating, that Paul could make such a profound statement with no scientific knowledge of cells or genetics. No one ever asked me about this, but as soon as you asked that question, it was the first thing that came to my mind. There are many other examples throughout Scripture where ancient statements align with modern scientific understanding. For instance, Paul describes the body of Christ as one body made up of many parts, the hand, the foot, the eye, all working together. He didn't know about cells, but this metaphor aligns perfectly with cell theory, which tells us the human body is one organism made of many individual living units. Yet this idea didn't even emerge until the 1600s and 1800s. It's truly remarkable how ancient texts can contain such deep scientific relevance hidden beneath the surface. Thank you so much for this conversation. It has been a privilege to explore these ideas and to share how ancient wisdom and modern science often intersect. And the closing invitation. I'm invited. The DI exam members can share feedback directly with me, including who you'd like us to interview and what topics you'd love us to explore. We're only accepting the first 10,000 members before registration closes. If you'd like to join, go to the link in the description or visit daxcircle.com. And finally, if you watch this show often, please make sure you're subscribed. It's a simple, free way to support us and keep this journey going. You're part of our history, and I deeply appreciate you for that. Thank you.